In recording the singular adventures which I shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have often observed that the public is inclined to regard his triumphs as springing from some peculiar magic of intellect, rather than from the patient accumulation of facts. Yet no man ever lived who paid stricter attention to the smallest practical detail. The affair of the moving curtain, though for many years suppressed from publication at the request of certain interested parties, stands, perhaps, as the finest example of how Holmes could perceive significance where all others saw only absurdity. It occurred in the autumn of 1893, during one of those bleak London weeks when the fog hangs low over the city like a funeral veil. The lamps along Baker Street glimmered faintly through the yellow murk, and the muffled clatter of passing hansoms came to us softened and distorted, as though from another world entirely. Holmes had spent the greater part of 3 days upon the sofa, clad in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, with his long fingers pressed together and his keen grey eyes half-closed in meditation. Beside him upon the table lay several chemical monographs, a Persian slipper filled with tobacco, and the violin which he would occasionally seize upon to draw from it some low and melancholy phrase before sinking once more into silence. As for myself, I had resumed a modest medical practice near Paddington, and was preparing notes upon a difficult case of nervous exhaustion when Holmes abruptly spoke. "Watson," said he, without opening his eyes, "what is the chief defect in the average witness?" I looked up from my papers. "He observes badly?" "On the contrary, he observes far too much." Holmes rode lazily onto one elbow. "The difficulty lies not in seeing, but in distinguishing what matters from what merely impresses the emotions. A frightened mind grants importance to trifles. You speak from experience?" "From Mrs. Hudson." At that moment our good landlady entered carrying the tray, though with considerably less composure than was her custom. Her face, ordinarily placid and rosy, was pale beneath the gaslight. "There's a lady below, Mr. Holmes," said she. "She insists upon seeing you at once. I told her it was near 11 o'clock, but she says she daren't wait until morning." Holmes sat upright immediately. "Did she give her name?" "No, sir, but she's in a terrible state." "Then by all means show her up." Mrs. Hudson withdrew, and Holmes cast a swift glance toward me. "You perceive, Watson, that our quiet evening is at an end." The woman who entered a moment later was perhaps 30 years of age, though distress had added several years to her appearance. She was richly but soberly dressed in deep grey travelling attire, and a dark veil partially concealed features which might once have been handsome. Her hands trembled visibly as she removed her gloves. Holmes rose and motioned her toward the chair beside the fire. "You are safe here, madam," said he gently. "Pray compose yourself and tell us what has occurred." She looked from Holmes to myself with an expression of desperate uncertainty. "You are Dr. Watson?" she asked. I bowed. "Then I am fortunate indeed. I have heard that you may both be trusted." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You honor us. Your name?" "Mrs. Clara Fenwick of Wycliffe Square." Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. "The widow of Edward Fenwick, the theatrical impresario." She started. "You know of my husband?" "Only by reputation. He died 2 years ago, if I recollect correctly, from injuries sustained in a carriage accident near Richmond." Holmes leaned back. "And now, Mrs. Fenwick, what danger brings you through the fog to Baker Street at this hour?" The lady clasped her hands tightly together. "Mr. Holmes, something is in my house." I confess I exchanged a glance with my companion, for her tone carried no trace of melodrama. It was the voice of genuine terror. "Something?" Holmes repeated quietly. She nodded. "At first I thought it imagination. Then I believed it must be thieves. Now I do not know what to believe." "Proceed in your own manner," said Holmes. Fenwick drew a long breath. "My husband purchased the house in Wycliffe Square shortly before his death. It is old-fashioned, with heavy furnishings and absurd velvet curtains in nearly every room. I have lived there quietly with only my maid and the butler since becoming widowed." "Your servants are long established?" "Martha has been with me 4 years. Briggs nearly 7. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And the curtains?" Again she stared. "The curtains? You mentioned them specifically." A faint shudder passed over her. "Forgive me. It sounds foolish when spoken aloud. Many truths do." She lowered her voice. "3 weeks ago I was seated in the morning room after dinner. There was no wind. The windows were latched, yet the curtain beside the fireplace moved." Holmes said nothing. "It did not sway naturally," she continued. "It jerked as though something behind it had brushed against the fabric. And you investigated?" "At once. There was nothing there." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "Go on." The same thing occurred the following evening, and the next. Always a curtain, always in whichever room I occupied. Did your servants witness this? That is what makes it so dreadful. It only happens when I am alone." Holmes rose and paced slowly toward the hearth. Mrs. Fenwick leaned forward anxiously. "You do not think me mad?" "My dear madam," said Holmes, "mad people seldom question their own sanity." I observed that she visibly relaxed at his words. "What happened next?" I asked. She turned toward me gratefully. "Last Monday matters became far worse. I was reading in the library at perhaps 10:30. The curtain near the French windows moved again. This time I was determined to prove the cause. I crossed the room immediately and pulled it aside. There was a man standing behind it. Even Holmes ceased pacing. "What sort of man?" said he sharply. I could not see clearly. The lamp was behind me, but he was tall and thin, with something white about the face. Before I could cry out, he slipped through the window into the garden. The window was unlocked? No! That is the horrible part. It was bolted from within. For the first time since her arrival, Holmes's expression altered markedly. He sat down once more and lit a cigarette with deliberate care. "You are certain of this?" I examined it myself. The bolt was still fastened. "Hum!" Holmes smoked in silence for perhaps a minute while the fog pressed thickly against the panes outside. "What action did you take?" "I summoned Briggs. We searched the grounds but found nothing." "And the police?" She hesitated. "I informed Inspector Gregson yesterday. He examined the house and suggested that anxiety had affected my nerves." Holmes gave a dry smile. A singularly unimaginative conclusion, though not entirely impossible. Her eyes flashed suddenly. "You think so, too?" "I think nothing yet. Facts first, conclusions afterward. Have there been further manifestations?" She swallowed. "When?" "Tonight." The words seemed to hang in the room. I was in my bedchamber preparing for sleep. The curtains around the bed began to tremble. From wind? There was no wind. And then? A voice spoke. Holmes leaned forward instantly. What did it say? Mrs. Fenwick's lips had gone pale. It said, "You should not have stayed in the house." A long silence followed. Even I, practical man though I was, felt an unpleasant chill creep across me. Outside, somewhere in the unseen street, a cabman shouted hoarsely through the fog. Holmes alone remained unmoved. "You saw no one?" "The room was searched." "And the doors?" Holmes abruptly crossed to the window and stood peering out into Baker Street. His thin figure appeared almost spectral against the swirling yellow mist. At last he spoke. "Watson, your revolver is in its usual drawer?" "It is." "You will oblige me by placing it in your pocket." Mrs. Fenwick uttered a faint cry. "Then you believe me?" Holmes turned, and I saw that hard brightness in his eyes which always appeared when his mind had seized upon the scent of a worthy problem. "My dear lady," said he, "I believe that someone wishes very earnestly to frighten you. Whether for gain, revenge, or concealment remains to be seen. You will come?" "At once." She half rose from her chair in relief. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, one more question before we depart." His voice became suddenly keen. "Did your husband ever speak of anything unusual connected with the house?" Mrs. Fenwick pressed a hand to her brow. "No. It was shortly before his death. He asked me, rather strangely, whether I had ever noticed the curtains moving at night." Holmes became perfectly still. "And what answer did you give?" I laughed at him. "And he seemed annoyed. He said there were things in the world which could move silently behind a curtain for years before stepping into the light." Holmes exchanged a rapid glance with me. "Indeed," said he softly, "that was a most remarkable observation." Within 10 minutes we had donned our coats and descended into the fog-bound street beside the distressed widow. As our cab rattled eastward through the dim labyrinth of London, Holmes remained sunk in thought, his long fingers drumming lightly upon his knee. Only once did he speak. "Watson?" It is one of the peculiarities of my friend Sherlock Holmes that, although his mind could ascend in an instant to the highest regions of abstract reasoning, he remained deeply attentive to the most commonplace affairs of daily life. Indeed, I have frequently observed that he approached a muddy boot with greater intellectual enthusiasm than another man might reserve for affairs of state. During our journey to Wycliffe Square, the fog thickened until the lamps of approaching carriages appeared as dim orange halos floating in darkness. The horses' hoofs struck the pavement with a hollow and muffled rhythm, while now and then the outline of some late pedestrian emerged suddenly from the mist only to vanish once more like a ghost upon the moor. Mrs. Fenwick sat opposite us in visible agitation. More than once she started violently at sounds from the street, and I could see by the tight clasp of her gloved hands that her nerves had been strained to the utmost. Holmes, however, appeared entirely at ease. "You have brought no luggage, Watson," said he suddenly. I stared at him. "Certainly not. We are merely visiting the lady's house." "Ah, but you intended to stay the night at your practice before returning to Baker Street." "I had no such intention." Holmes smiled faintly and pointed toward my left sleeve. "You have forgotten the small stain of iodine upon your cuff. It is fresh. You visited a patient shortly before returning home. Had you expected another excursion this evening, you would have changed before dinner, for Mrs. Watson once cured you of medical untidiness." I laughed despite the grim nature of our errand. "You reason backward from trifles. Always. The larger facts are frequently deceptive." Mrs. Fenwick looked at him earnestly. "How can you think calmly at such a time, Mr. Holmes?" "My dear madam," said he, emotion clouds precision. "The moment I permit fear or excitement to govern my judgment, I become no better than the police." I noticed the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, which indicated that Inspector Gregson had already been placed among the lesser intellects of London in Holmes's estimation. Our cab at last turned into Wycliffe Square, a sombre and respectable crescent lined with dark brick houses whose windows glimmered faintly through the haze. The square itself was deserted save for a solitary constable pacing beneath the gas lamps. Mrs. Fenwick's residence stood near the northern corner. It was a tall and narrow structure of considerable age, distinguished chiefly by the heavy velvet draperies which hung even across the lower windows. These curtains, visible from the street despite the dim light within, gave the house a strangely shuttered and secretive appearance. Holmes remained motionless for several seconds before alighting. "What is it?" I asked. "The windows," said he quietly. "What of them?" "They are arranged to conceal observation from without, yet permit excellent observation from within. Curious." Fenwick unlocked the front door with trembling fingers, and we entered a broad hallway dimly illuminated by a single gas jet. The interior possessed the stale richness characteristic of old London houses' thick carpets, dark wood panelling, and portraits whose eyes seemed to follow one through the shadows. A gaunt elderly butler appeared almost immediately. "Thank God you've come, madam," said he. "There have been more noises." "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Mrs. Fenwick quickly. "And Dr. Watson." The butler bowed stiffly. "Briggs, sir." "At your service." Holmes removed his gloves leisurely. "You heard these noises yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Footsteps overhead." "At what hour?" "About 10 o'clock." "And you investigated?" "I searched the upper floor immediately. There was no one there." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Your hearing is good?" The butler blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You are not deaf?" "No, sir." "That simplifies matters." Without another word, Holmes began slowly traversing the hall, examining walls, carpet edges, umbrella stands, and even the brass umbrella hooks beside the door. His manner had changed completely. The languid dreamer of Baker Street had vanished, replaced by the alert and tireless machine of reason whom I had accompanied upon so many strange adventures. Mrs. Fenwick watched anxiously. "Do you already suspect someone?" Holmes stooped suddenly beside the staircase. "My dear madam, I suspect everyone until evidence removes them from consideration." He pointed toward the carpet. "You observe this indentation, Watson?" I bent beside him but could discern little. "The carpet is flattened." "Precisely. By what?" "Foot traffic." "Too narrow." A long object rested here repeatedly, something with weight concentrated upon 4 small points. A ladder. A ladder! Holmes rose immediately. "And recently used." Briggs frowned heavily. "There's no ladder in the hall, sir." "Quite so. Which makes its disappearance especially interesting." Before the butler could answer, Holmes abruptly strode toward the drawing-room. "Show me where the curtain moved tonight." Mrs. Fenwick led us into a richly furnished chamber overlooking the square. The room contained no fewer than 6 immense curtains of dark crimson velvet, each hanging from ceiling to floor in folds so heavy that a man might easily conceal himself behind them. I confess the sight produced a distinct discomfort in me. "There," whispered Mrs. Fenwick, pointing toward the bedchamber doorway beyond. Holmes crossed immediately to the curtain nearest the fireplace and drew it aside. Nothing. He examined the floorboards, the skirting, the folds of cloth themselves, and finally the curtain rod overhead. Then he smiled. "What is it?" I cried. Instead of replying, Holmes turned to Briggs. "Who cleans these curtains?" "Martha the maid, sir." "How often?" "Once a fortnight." Holmes ran one finger delicately across the velvet. "And yet there is fresh dust disturbed here at shoulder height." Mrs. Fenwick stared. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Holmes, "that someone recently parted the curtain while wearing gloves of rough material. Then there was someone behind it, undoubtedly. A visible tremor passed through her. But the window—" Yes, locked from within." Holmes's eyes glittered. "That is the point which interests me above all others." He moved swiftly now from room to room with an energy that left us struggling to follow. He examined windows, fireplaces, servant passages, cupboards, and even the cellar stairs. Once he halted so suddenly that I nearly collided with him. "Do not step there, Watson."
"Why?"
He pointed downward. Upon the polished wood near the dining-room entrance lay a tiny white fragment scarcely larger than a fingernail clipping. Holmes picked it up carefully. "Plaster," said he softly. "From the wall? Possibly. Or from a ceiling. What significance has that? None yet. But significance frequently arrives later to collect its belongings. I have never known another man capable of uttering such absurd statements with complete seriousness. At last we entered the library, the very chamber, as Mrs. Fenwick informed us, where she had first encountered the mysterious intruder behind the curtain. It was a gloomy apartment lined with books and illuminated by a green-shaded lamp upon the central desk. Tall French windows opened upon a narrow garden at the rear. Holmes examined the window bolt immediately. "You are correct," said he. "No tampering." "Then how did the man escape?" I asked. Holmes crouched silently beside the curtains. After several moments he spoke in a low voice. "Watson, would you kindly stand where Mrs. Fenwick stood that night?" I obeyed. "Now look toward the curtain." "I see nothing." "Because you are observing normally. But suppose you were frightened?" "I still fail to." Holmes suddenly snapped the curtain sharply sideways. I started involuntarily, for in that instant I distinctly perceived the outline of a man standing behind the folds. Then the illusion vanished. "Extraordinary!" I exclaimed. Holmes nodded. "The eye retains impressions imperfectly in dim light. For a fraction of a second the folds resemble a human figure." Mrs. Fenwick looked bewildered. "Then there was no intruder?" "Oh, there was certainly an intruder," said Holmes calmly, "but perhaps not where you imagined." At that moment a loud crash echoed from the floor above. Mrs. Fenwick screamed. Briggs turned pale. Holmes, however, sprang toward the door with astonishing speed. "Come, Watson!" We rushed upstairs together, Holmes drawing a dark lantern from his coat as he ran. The corridor above was utterly silent save for the distant ticking of a clock. Then came another sound, a slow creaking. Holmes raised one hand sharply for silence. The noise came from the very end of the corridor, where a heavy curtain hung across a recessed alcove. It moved, not gently, not from wind, but with the unmistakable motion of something alive shifting behind it. I felt my hand tighten around the revolver in my pocket. Holmes advanced without hesitation. The curtain swayed once more. Then, before either of us could react, a pale face emerged suddenly from the darkness beyond, and vanished again with impossible speed. "After him!" cried Holmes. He tore aside the curtain. Behind it lay only a blank wall. No door, no passage, no man, nothing. Yet upon the floor beneath the curtain rested a single object, a white theatre mask, and across its forehead, written in dark ink, were the words, "You were warned." For several seconds after the discovery of the mask none of us spoke. The silence of that dim upper corridor seemed almost unnatural, broken only by the distant rumble of carriage wheels somewhere beyond the fog-covered square. Holmes stood perfectly motionless beneath the gaslight, the white theatrical mask dangling from his long fingers while his keen eyes examined every inch of the alcove. I confess that even my nerves, strengthened by years of strange adventures in my companion service, were profoundly shaken by the incident. The apparition had appeared so suddenly and vanished with such impossible swiftness that I could scarcely persuade myself it had been real. Fenwick had sunk weakly against the wall. "You saw him," she whispered. "You both saw him." Holmes ignored the remark entirely. "Watson," said he quietly, "describe precisely what you observed." Yes, a wonderfully exact medical diagnosis." "What sort of face?" "It was pale. The mask has supplied that impression for you after the fact." "Begin again." "I concentrated. It appeared thin, perhaps elderly. I could not distinguish the features clearly." "And what else?" "He withdrew instantly after appearing." Holmes nodded. "You are improving." Mrs. Fenwick stared at him in astonishment. "You speak as though this was some classroom exercise." "My dear madam," said Holmes, still studying the wall, Terror is most effectively resisted through accuracy. He suddenly knelt beside the skirting board and directed the beam of his lantern downward. "What is it now?" I asked. Instead of answering, Holmes passed the lantern to me. "Observe closely beneath the curtain hem." At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, as I lowered the light, several tiny scratches became visible upon the polished floorboards. "They are fresh," said Holmes. "Made within hours. By shoes. No metal." He measured the distance between the marks with astonishing precision using merely his fingers. Mrs. Fenwick approached nervously. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you tell me honestly what is happening in this house." Holmes rose slowly. "That," said he, slipping the mask into his pocket, "is precisely what I intend to discover." His eyes travelled once more across the blank wall behind the curtain. "You are certain there is no room beyond this?" "Quite certain," she replied. "The exterior wall faces the adjoining property. And the neighbouring house?" "Vacant for nearly a year." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "Indeed?" Without another word he seized the gas lamp from the corridor bracket and disappeared downstairs at such speed that I hurried after him in considerable confusion. We found him moments later standing at the rear garden door, examining the neighbouring building through the fog. It was a narrow, neglected structure of 3 stories, dark from roof to cellar. Several shutters hung crookedly, and the small rear garden had become choked with weeds. "How long has it been empty?" Holmes asked. "Since last winter," said Briggs. "Owner died abroad, they say." "And no caretaker?" "Not that I know of." Holmes remained silent. Then, suddenly, "Watson, did you bring matches?" "We shall require them." Mrs. Fenwick uttered a startled cry. "You do not mean to enter that dreadful place tonight?" "Most assuredly. But it may be dangerous." Holmes gave one of his rare, thin smiles. "My dear lady, danger is merely excitement viewed through the wrong end of a telescope." I had heard many peculiar expressions from Holmes over the years, yet even now I occasionally wondered whether he invented half of them merely to confuse respectable society. Within minutes we had crossed the narrow boundary wall separating the 2 gardens. The fog here was especially dense, wreathing itself among the dead shrubs like drifting smoke. The back entrance of the abandoned house stood partially concealed beneath ivy. Holmes examined the lock briefly. "Recently used. How can you tell?" I asked. "The scratches are bright." He inserted a thin instrument from his waistcoat pocket, manipulated it delicately for several seconds, and the door swung inward with a long, creaking groan. The darkness beyond was complete. Holmes lit the lantern. The beam revealed a narrow kitchen thick with dust and neglect. Broken crockery littered the shelves, while great sheets covered the furniture like burial cloths. Yet despite the abandonment, certain details struck me immediately. The dust near the doorway had been disturbed, and somewhere within the house, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of movement. Mrs. Fenwick clutched my arm. "Oh, heavens!" Holmes merely raised a finger for silence. We advanced cautiously through a passage into what had once been a dining room. The air possessed the stale odor of long confinement mingled curiously with another scent which I could not immediately place. Holmes stopped abruptly. "Oil." "Yes," said I suddenly. "Machine oil." His lantern beam swept slowly across the floor. Then he smiled. There, cutting directly through the dust, lay a trail of recent footprints. Not one set, several. And among them were narrow parallel grooves as though something heavy had been repeatedly dragged across the boards. Holmes followed the marks with intense concentration until they terminated beside the far wall. A perfectly ordinary wall, yet Holmes tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound differed. "Hollow," said he softly. Mrs. Fenwick gasped. "You mean there is a passage?" "Almost certainly." He examined the paneling carefully, running his fingers across the woodwork with extraordinary delicacy. At last he pressed against a carved moulding near the fireplace. With a sharp click, part of the wall swung inward. Beyond lay darkness, a concealed corridor. Even Holmes appeared momentarily impressed. "Well," said he quietly, "our curtain begins to rise." The passage was narrow and low-ceilinged, extending forward into blackness. The walls were unfinished brick, damp with age, and the air felt cold and stale upon the skin. "This house is centuries older than the adjoining structures," Holmes murmured. "The corridor was likely constructed for smuggling or priest-hiding during earlier times. But where does it lead?" I asked. Holmes lifted the lantern higher. "Only one way to discover that." We proceeded single file through the hidden corridor for perhaps 20 yards before Holmes halted once more. Ahead of us stood a wooden ladder ascending vertically through a square opening. Instantly I recalled the strange flattened marks upon Mrs. Fenwick's hall carpet. "The ladder!" I exclaimed. "Precisely." Holmes ascended first. I followed closely behind, revolver ready. The opening above emerged behind another hanging curtain. Holmes drew it aside carefully. We had entered the concealed alcove at the upper corridor of Mrs. Fenwick's house, the very spot where the face had appeared. Fenwick gave a low cry of horror. "Then someone has been entering my house secretly." "For some time," said Holmes grimly. He descended again immediately and began examining the corridor with renewed energy. "Observe, Watson, the arrangement is elegant in its simplicity. A vacant neighboring house permits unrestricted access. Hidden passages enable movement between buildings. Curtains conceal entrances. The victim is gradually terrorized until her nerves collapse." "But why?" "That remains the central question." He continued onward through the hidden corridor until we arrived at a small chamber scarcely larger than a closet. And there Holmes found the first truly alarming evidence. A table stood against the wall. Upon it rested food, candles, and several newspapers only days old. Someone had been living there. More disturbing still was the object beside the candle. A photograph. Holmes seized it instantly. Mrs. Fenwick stared in shock. It was a portrait of her husband, Edward Fenwick. Yet the photograph had been violently scratched across the face, leaving the features almost destroyed. Holmes examined it silently. Then his attention shifted toward another item half concealed beneath the table. A theater program. Its edges had yellowed with age. Holmes unfolded it carefully. "What is it?" I asked. He passed it to me. The program advertised a theatrical performance at the Lyceum Theatre dated nearly 15 years earlier, and among the listed performers appeared a name which caused Mrs. Fenwick to utter a faint cry. "Arthur Vale. You know him?" Holmes asked quickly. "He worked for my husband many years ago. An actor. What became of him?" "He disappeared." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "There was some dreadful scandal involving stolen money. My husband dismissed him, and shortly afterward he vanished entirely." Holmes turned the program over thoughtfully. Then he froze. Upon the reverse side, written hastily in faded ink, were several words. I read them over his shoulder. "He knows about the room." For the first time that evening I observed genuine excitement blaze in Holmes's eyes. "My dear Watson," said he softly, "we have at last stumbled upon something exceedingly interesting." At that exact instant a door slammed violently somewhere above us. Then came running footsteps. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. "Quiet," he whispered sharply. In the darkness we heard movement overhead. Slow footsteps, crossing the floor directly above the hidden chamber. Then, very distinctly, the sound of a curtain being drawn aside. The footsteps overhead continued for several moments, and then ceased so abruptly that the silence itself became oppressive. We remained motionless within the hidden chamber, Holmes standing like a statue in the darkness beside me. I could barely distinguish the outline of his tall figure, though I knew from long experience that every faculty of his extraordinary mind was now concentrated upon the sounds above us. Mrs. Fenwick's breathing had become quick and uneven. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered faintly, "what are we to do?" "Hush!" Another sound followed, not footsteps this time, a soft dragging noise. Then the unmistakable rustle of heavy curtains moving slowly across brass rods. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "There are 2 persons above us. How can you tell? One walks confidently. The other moves cautiously and avoids loose boards." Before I could frame another question, a sharp metallic click sounded overhead. Then came a voice, male, and filled with cold amusement. "She has brought detectives into the matter sooner than expected." Mrs. Fenwick clutched my sleeve in terror. It was the same voice she had heard in her bedchamber. A second voice answered almost immediately. "You should leave the house tonight." This voice differed completely, rougher, nervous, with the accent of the London stage. The first man laughed softly. "Not yet. There is still time." Then silence again. Holmes moved instantly. He relit the lantern, crossed the chamber in 3 swift strides, and mounted the hidden ladder without hesitation. I followed at his heels with revolver drawn. We burst into the upper corridor. The curtains swayed gently. Nothing more. Holmes darted toward the staircase, descended at astonishing speed, and flung open the drawing-room door. No one. The library, dining room, empty. Yet one fact was instantly evident. The front door stood open. Briggs appeared from the kitchen in great agitation. "Someone just left the house, sir. I heard the door slam." "How long ago?" "Half a minute at most." Holmes rushed outside into the square. I have rarely seen London more ghostly than at that hour. The fog rolled thick and yellow beneath the lamps, obscuring the far side of the street entirely. Somewhere nearby carriage wheels rattled unseen through the mist, while distant footsteps echoed strangely from invisible pavements. Holmes stood perfectly still in the center of the square, listening. Then suddenly he sprang forward with remarkable agility. "This way!" We pursued him across the street and into a narrow lane bordering the square. Holmes halted beside the curb and pointed downward. "Fresh wheel tracks. A cab," said I. "Waiting here recently." "How do you know?" "The horse dropped ash from its nose-bag mixed with fresh oats. Observe also the deep impression from prolonged standing." Mrs. Fenwick stared in astonishment. "You can tell all that from the street?" "My dear madam," said Holmes impatiently, "London writes its history beneath our feet." He followed the tracks for perhaps 20 yards before stopping once more. "Too late," he murmured. They anticipated pursuit. "Who are they?" I asked. "That," said Holmes, "depends entirely upon whether our intruders are working together or against one another." Before I could reply, a heavy hand descended suddenly upon my shoulder. I turned sharply. Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard stood behind us, wrapped in a thick overcoat, his broad red face gleaming with satisfaction beneath the gaslight. "Evening, Mr. Holmes," said he cheerfully. "Thought I might find you here." Holmes's expression became politely blank. Gregson nodded toward the house. "Your lady friend sent for me earlier this evening after another disturbance. Thought I'd come by and see whether our ghost had materialized." "There has indeed been movement," said Holmes dryly. "So I heard." Gregson's small eyes twinkled with unmistakable triumph. "And I fancy I've solved your mystery already." Mrs. Fenwick stepped forward eagerly. "You have found the man?" "I believe so, madam." Holmes lit a cigarette with complete indifference. "Indeed? Pray enlighten us." Gregson puffed himself up visibly. "The business is perfectly straightforward. Your hidden passages and theatre masks gave the whole thing away." "Oh," said Holmes. "The culprit is an actor." Holmes exhaled smoke slowly. "A remarkable leap." "Not at all. We made inquiries this evening at several theatrical lodging-houses. One name surfaced repeatedly: Arthur Vale. At the mention of the name, Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly, though his tone remained careless. The same Arthur Vale connected with Mr. Edward Fenwick. The very man. Gregson folded his arms confidently. "He's been seen near Wycliffe Square several times these past weeks." Mrs. Fenwick turned pale. "But I thought he disappeared years ago." "So he did. After stealing money from your husband's theatre company." Holmes flicked ash into the fog. "And now he returns to haunt the widow?" Gregson seemed immensely pleased with himself. A discharged actor with a grievance. Hides in the vacant house next door. Uses old passages to frighten the lady. "Simple enough." "Simple indeed," murmured Holmes. The inspector lowered his voice dramatically. "And there's more. We searched Arthur Vale's former lodgings tonight. We found blood-stained clothing." Mrs. Fenwick gasped. "Blah." Gregson nodded heavily. "Along with threatening letters addressed to your late husband." Holmes's expression did not alter by so much as a fraction. "Curious timing." "What do you mean?" "That these discoveries should occur upon the very night we enter the case." Gregson frowned. "You don't dispute the evidence?" "My dear Gregson, evidence is like tobacco ash. It means nothing until one knows who dropped it." The inspector sniffed irritably. "You always complicate matters unnecessarily, Mr. Holmes. We've already issued orders for Vale's arrest. Have you seen him?" "But we shall soon enough." Holmes smiled faintly. "I sincerely hope so." Gregson's confidence returned at once. "Well, I dare say the matter is nearly concluded, though I admit your hidden corridor was a clever discovery." "Thank you." "Of course," added Gregson magnanimously, "you have a talent for noticing odd details." Holmes bowed slightly. "And you, Gregson, possess a genius for arranging them incorrectly." The inspector reddened visibly. Before he could respond, however, Briggs emerged hurriedly from the house carrying an envelope. "This was just delivered, sir," said he nervously. "A boy brought it." Holmes took the letter immediately. It bore no address, only a crude symbol drawn in black ink, a theatre curtain. Holmes opened it. Inside lay a single sheet upon which were written several hurried lines. He read them silently. Then, for the first time that evening, I saw genuine surprise upon his face. "What is it?" I demanded. Without answering, Holmes handed me the paper. The message read, "If Gregson arrests Arthur Vale, an innocent man will hang." The curtain moves for another. Below the message appeared one final line: "Ask about the room above the stage." Gregson gave an annoyed grunt. More theatrical nonsense. Holmes folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. On the contrary, said he quietly, it may prove the first honest statement we have yet encountered. The inspector scoffed. You don't seriously believe Vale innocent? Holmes looked out into the dense yellow fog blanketing the square. I believe, said he slowly, that someone is playing a far deeper game than you presently imagine. And this mysterious room above the stage. Holmes's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. That, said he, is the phrase which troubles me most. Mrs. Fenwick stepped nearer. Do you know what it means? But you suspect something? Holmes remained silent for several moments. Then abruptly, Watson, do you recall the odor within the hidden chamber? The machine oil? And the newspapers? All recent. He nodded. Then our unknown visitor has occupied that room continuously. Gregson laughed shortly. Exactly. Arthur Vale hiding like a rat. But Holmes turned slowly toward him. But there was one object absent from that chamber. What object? A bed. The inspector blinked. So, said Holmes softly, our hidden resident did not sleep there. A strange expression crossed his face than one might had learned to recognize during our most dangerous investigations. Holmes had perceived something important, yet true to his maddening habit he chose not to explain it. Instead, he merely drew his coat tighter against the fog and began walking back toward the house. Come, Watson, said he quietly. The night's work has only begun. As we re-entered the dim hallway of Wycliffe Square, I could not escape the growing conviction that somewhere within the shadows of that ancient house there existed a secret far darker than a mere campaign of intimidation. And Sherlock Holmes, though already closer to the truth than any of us, was keeping a crucial piece of the puzzle entirely to himself. It has long been my experience that Sherlock Holmes became most dangerous when he appeared least interested. During the remainder of that extraordinary night at Wycliffe Square, he adopted an attitude of near indifference which utterly deceived Inspector Gregson and profoundly irritated me. While the worthy detective bustled about the house issuing instructions and examining servants with loud official importance, Holmes lounged in the library chair smoking cigarette after cigarette and staring absently into the fire. Yet I knew him too well. The half-closed eyes, the idle fingers tapping the armrest, the languid posture all were signs that his mind worked with tremendous intensity beneath the surface calm. At 1:30 in the morning Gregson finally departed, taking with him the white theatre mask and promising confidently that Arthur Vale would be in custody before dawn. Fenwick had retired upstairs under considerable distress, while Briggs secured the doors with unnecessary enthusiasm. Holmes and I remained alone in the library. "Well, I asked at last. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked slowly toward the heavy curtains beside the French windows. "Watson," said he quietly, "what do you know of theatres?" "Very little. Have you ever stood upon a stage and looked outward into darkness? It is a curious sensation. The audience remains invisible while every movement of the actor is exposed beneath the lamps." He drew the curtain slightly aside and peered into the foggy garden. Theatre people understand concealment better than most men. Illusion is their profession. You think the explanation lies in Fenwick's theatrical connections? I am certain of it. He turned abruptly. "Tell me, Watson, what detail has repeated itself throughout this affair?" "The curtains." "Precisely. Curtains in hallways, curtains concealing passages, curtains framing apparitions, even the symbol upon the anonymous letter. You believe it symbolic?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that someone wishes us to think theatrically." He resumed pacing. "The phrase interests me deeply. The room above the stage. What could it mean?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, in old Victorian theatres there often existed concealed rooms above or behind the stage machinery. Storage chambers, observation points, occasionally even private entrances. You think there is another hidden room here?" "Possibly." He halted suddenly beside the fireplace. "Though not necessarily here. I had learned patience during my years with Holmes, yet I confess his cryptic manner occasionally strained it severely." "Then where?" "At Fenwick's old theatre. The Lyceum?" Holmes's eyes gleamed sharply. Edward Fenwick owned 3 theatres during his career. The Lyceum was merely one of them. "How do you know?" "Because his obituary contained inaccuracies. Before I could demand explanation, Holmes seized his hat. "Come, Watson." "At this hour?" "Especially at this hour. Within 20 minutes we were rattling eastward through the sleeping city in a hansom cab. London after midnight possesses a character entirely distinct from the bustling metropolis of daylight. The fog drifted through deserted streets like pale smoke, while the gas lamps cast trembling circles upon wet pavement. Here and there shadowy figures moved through the gloom, dock workers, policemen, late revelers, and those unfortunate creatures who inhabit the darker margins of civilized society. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey. At length our cab stopped before a narrow street near Holborn. Before us stood an old theatre. Its faded sign read, "The Imperial Arcadia." The building appeared long abandoned. Several windows were boarded, and the entrance displayed weather stains from years of neglect. "You never mentioned this theatre," I said. "Because I only confirmed its existence this evening." Holmes paid the cabman and approached the side entrance. "Observe the architecture, Watson. The place is decaying, yes, but originally designed with unusual complexity. Multiple backstage corridors, elevated rigging systems, private access routes." He examined the lock briefly. "Recently disturbed." Again that thin steel instrument appeared from his pocket. Moments later we entered. The stale air smelled of dust, mildew, and old wood. Holmes lit his lantern, revealing rows of empty seats descending toward a shadowed stage. The effect was profoundly eerie. In the dim light, the theatre resembled a dead cathedral dedicated to forgotten entertainments. Holmes advanced slowly down the aisle. "Edward Fenwick purchased this theatre 15 years ago," said he quietly. 3 months later, an incident occurred involving missing funds and one of his leading actors, Arthur Vale. The scandal Mrs. Fenwick mentioned. Exactly. We climbed onto the stage itself, where fragments of scenery still stood abandoned beneath great draped curtains. Holmes directed the lantern upward. High above us hung the fly tower, a maze of ropes, pulleys, platforms, and dark recesses disappearing into shadow. "The room above the stage," he murmured. A narrow staircase ascended beside the wings. Holmes mounted it immediately. The structure creaked alarmingly beneath our feet as we climbed higher and higher above the auditorium until the rows of seats below appeared tiny and distant in the darkness. At last we reached a small landing. Before us stood a concealed wooden door nearly invisible against the surrounding beams. Holmes examined it carefully. No dust. "You mean someone still uses it?" "Frequently." He pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was surprisingly large and occupied. A candle still burned upon the table. Blankets lay folded in one corner. Several newspapers rested nearby. The room bore unmistakable signs of recent habitation. Holmes crossed swiftly toward the table. "What is this?" He picked up a stack of papers tied with faded ribbon. Dozens of them. Most were addressed to Edward Fenwick. Holmes began reading rapidly. Then his expression changed completely. For perhaps the first time since the case began, I saw genuine astonishment upon his face. "Good heavens!" he whispered. "What is it?" Instead of answering, he handed me one of the letters. The handwriting was elegant yet desperate. "He knows what happened in the upper room. If the truth comes out, neither of us will survive it. You swore Arthur would remain silent." The signature below caused my blood to chill. It read, "Clara Fenwick." "The widow?" I exclaimed. Holmes nodded slowly. "Written 14 years ago. But then she knows, much more than she has admitted." He continued searching rapidly through the papers. Most concerned theatrical business, financial disputes, and increasingly frantic references to some unnamed event hidden within the upper room. Then Holmes uncovered something else, a newspaper clipping. He spread it beneath the candlelight. The article reported the sudden disappearance of a theatre actress named Eleanor Vale. "Sister to Arthur Vale," Holmes said quietly. "She vanished?" "On the very night of the financial scandal." A cold sensation crept through me. "You think the two events were connected?" Holmes's eyes hardened. "I no longer think Arthur Vale stole anything." Before I could reply, a sound echoed from below. Someone had entered the theatre. Holmes extinguished the candle instantly. We stood motionless in darkness. The footsteps advanced slowly across the stage beneath us. Then came the beam of a lantern moving through the auditorium. A voice spoke. Male, and unmistakably familiar. "Search carefully. He may already be here." I recognized it instantly. "Inspector Gregson." Another man answered nervously. "We should not have come back." Holmes gripped my arm sharply. The second voice. It belonged to the mysterious man from the hidden passage. The same rough theatrical accent. Arthur Vale. Gregson and Vale were together. I stared at Holmes in astonishment. He merely smiled faintly in the darkness. "My dear Watson," he whispered, "the plot thickens admirably." Below us the lantern beam swept across the stage. Then Gregson spoke again. If Holmes finds those letters before us, everything changes. Holmes's grip tightened slightly upon my sleeve. For the first time since I had known him, I sensed that even Sherlock Holmes had stepped into a mystery more dangerous than he had anticipated. And somewhere within the abandoned theatre, hidden among shadows and curtains and lies 14 years old, there existed a secret worth killing to protect. Holmes drew me silently backward into the deeper shadows of the concealed chamber, while the lantern light below wandered slowly across the stage. I could hear Inspector Gregson distinctly now, his heavy tread contrasting sharply with the lighter and more hesitant movements of the man beside him. Arthur Vale, the supposed fugitive, the man whom Scotland Yard had publicly accused of terrorizing Mrs. Fenwick, and yet he now searched the abandoned theatre alongside the very inspector charged with hunting him. The contradiction was so astonishing that for several moments I doubted my own senses. Holmes, however, seemed entirely unsurprised. Indeed, there was a curious satisfaction in his expression, as though some private theory had at last received confirmation. Gregson's voice floated upward once more. "You are certain no one followed you?" "No," replied Vale nervously, "but Holmes sees too much. He sees only what is placed before him." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly at that remark. "You promise me protection," Vale whispered harshly, "and you shall have it provided you remain useful." The lantern beam disappeared briefly behind a hanging stage curtain. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "We must hear more." "How?" Quietly. With astonishing agility he moved toward a narrow grated opening overlooking the stage below. I followed carefully, every ancient board beneath our feet groaning ominously. Through the grate I obtained my first clear view of Arthur Vale. He was a gaunt man, perhaps near 50, though hardship and fear had aged him considerably. His face was pale and deeply lined, while streaks of grey ran through his once dark hair. Even in anxiety there lingered something theatrical about his manner, the instinctive gestures of a performer long accustomed to dramatic expression. Gregson stood beside him holding the lantern. "You should never have sent those letters," the inspector muttered. "I had no choice. You panicked too easily." Vale turned sharply. "You did not see her face tonight. She remembers more than before." Gregson cursed beneath his breath. "Then frighten her further. Keep her confused. And Holmes—" At that Gregson fell silent. I felt Holmes become perfectly still beside me. Then the inspector spoke in a colder tone than I had ever heard from him. "If necessary," said he quietly, "Holmes can be managed." The words sent an unpleasant sensation through me. Even Holmes's expression altered subtly. Before either of us could react further, however, another sound interrupted the conversation. A crash, somewhere backstage. Gregson wheeled instantly. "Who's there?" The lantern beam jerked wildly across the curtains. Vale recoiled visibly. Then came running footsteps. Not approaching, fleeing. Gregson swore violently. After him. Both men rushed off stage and vanished into darkness. Holmes moved immediately. "Come, Watson." We descended the staircase at speed and emerged behind the stage just in time to hear a door slam somewhere within the theatre's lower corridors. Holmes raced forward with extraordinary energy, the lantern flashing through narrow passages thick with dust and hanging scenery. "Which way?" I cried. He pointed downward. Fresh footprints crossed the grime. 3 separate sets. Vale, and another unknown person. The chase led through twisting backstage corridors until suddenly Holmes halted so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. A terrible smell filled the air. Not merely dampness, not decay, but blood. Holmes lifted the lantern higher. The passage ahead ended at a small storeroom. Its door stood half open, and upon the floor just inside lay a man. He was stretched upon his back with one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him. Blood had spread across his shirt front and pooled darkly upon the boards. Gregson knelt beside the body, pale beneath his usual redness. Arthur Vale stood against the wall, trembling violently. "My God!" I exclaimed. Holmes crossed the room instantly. "Alive?" I bent beside the fallen man. One glance told me the truth. "He is dead." The victim appeared to be perhaps 40 years of age, strongly built, with coarse features and a heavy black moustache. His clothes suggested respectable means, though his face bore the hardened expression of a man long familiar with danger. A knife protruded from his chest. Holmes examined it carefully without touching. "Recently killed," said he quietly. Gregson rose stiffly. "This changes everything." "Indeed," said Holmes. Vale stared wildly at the corpse. "I swear I never touched him." Holmes looked sharply toward him. "You know the man?" No, but I saw him before. Where? Near Wycliffe Square. Gregson frowned. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Because I feared him. Holmes's eyes flashed. Feared him why? Vale hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he watched the house, Mrs. Fenwick's house. Holmes crouched beside the corpse once more. Watson examined the hands. I obeyed. The fingers were roughened and scarred. Manual labor, said I. Yes, but not ordinary labor. Observe the stains. Dark marks discolored the fingertips. Grease, I said. Machine grease, Holmes corrected. The same odor we detected in the hidden chamber. Gregson crossed his arms impatiently. Well, there's no mystery now. One criminal turns upon another. Very common. Holmes ignored him entirely. Instead, he studied the dead man's boots with intense concentration. Then he smiled faintly. What now? I demanded. The soles. What about them? They contained fresh plaster dust. Instantly I recalled the tiny white fragment Holmes had discovered in Mrs. Fenwick's house. You think this man entered the hidden passages? Repeatedly. Gregson snorted. So he was part of the gang? Possibly. Holmes rose slowly. But there is one curious inconsistency. What inconsistency? Asked Gregson. Holmes pointed toward the knife. The wound. I examined it again carefully. Then I understood. The angle, I said suddenly. It entered downward. Precisely. Holmes nodded approvingly. The killer was considerably taller than the victim or attacked from elevation. Gregson waved dismissively. Meaningless. Hardly. Holmes moved toward the storeroom doorway. No signs of struggle. The victim entered willingly. Vale spoke suddenly from the corner. He came looking for something. Holmes turned sharply. What do you mean? I saw him earlier tonight searching near the stage. For what? Vale swallowed nervously. I think he wanted the papers. The letters? Gregson's face darkened instantly. You told him about the letters? No. Then how did he know? Vale shook visibly. I don't know. Holmes watched the exchange with growing interest. Then his attention shifted suddenly toward the dead man's coat pocket. A small corner of paper protruded from within. Holmes withdrew it carefully. A photograph. The moment the lantern illuminated it, Arthur Vale uttered a cry of horror. It was Eleanor Vale, the missing actress, the woman who had vanished 14 years earlier. Yet this photograph had been taken recently. Very recently. She's alive, whispered Vale. Holmes examined the image in silence. On the back appeared a handwritten address, 17 Campden Court, and beneath it, she remembers everything. Before any of us could speak, a sound echoed from the passage outside. Running rapidly toward us, a constable burst into the room, breathless and pale. Gregson turned sharply. What is it? There's been another attack. Where? At Wycliffe Square. My heart lurched. Mrs. Fenwick? The constable nodded. The servants found her unconscious in the upper corridor. Gregson swore violently. Is she alive? Yes, but barely. Holmes seized his coat instantly. Come, Watson. As we hurried from the theatre, Arthur Vale caught Holmes by the sleeve. You don't understand, he whispered desperately. If she begins remembering now, we're all dead men. Holmes looked at him steadily. My dear Mr. Vale, said he quietly, someone appears determined to ensure precisely that outcome. The fog outside had thickened even further, swirling through the empty streets like smoke from some monstrous unseen fire. And as our cab thundered back toward Wycliffe Square, I could not shake the growing certainty that the case had crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer merely a campaign of terror. Someone had begun killing. And Sherlock Holmes, though outwardly calm, was moving ever closer toward a truth so dangerous that multiple people seemed willing to murder in order to conceal it. By the time we reached Wycliffe Square, the faint grey light of approaching dawn had begun filtering through the London fog, lending the deserted streets a cold and spectral appearance. A small crowd had gathered before Mrs. Fenwick's resident servants from neighbouring houses, a constable and several curious onlookers wrapped in heavy coats against the morning chill. Their murmured speculations ceased abruptly as Holmes sprang from the cab and strode toward the entrance without so much as a glance in their direction. Inside, the atmosphere was one of confusion and fear. Mrs. Fenwick's maid Martha stood weeping openly in the hallway while Briggs paced in visible agitation near the staircase. She's upstairs, sir, the butler said hoarsely. Doctor says she may recover, but Holmes was already ascending. We found Mrs. Fenwick lying upon a sofa in her bedchamber, pale as death beneath the lamplight. A local physician, whom I recognized slightly from hospital practice, stood beside her with an expression of grave concern. "She received a severe shock," said he quietly, "possibly accompanied by strangulation." "Strangulation?" I repeated sharply. The doctor pointed toward faint bruising upon her throat. "She was attacked from behind." Holmes bent over the unconscious woman with extraordinary concentration. Then his eyes traveled slowly across the room. Every curtain had been ripped violently from its rods. Heavy folds of crimson velvet lay scattered across the floor like pools of dark blood. "What happened here?" Holmes asked. Martha wrung her hands desperately. "I heard her scream, sir. Briggs and I rushed upstairs. We found the room like this, and Mrs. Fenwick. She was lying near the doorway." Holmes examined the torn curtains carefully. "No knife marks. What does that mean?" I asked. "They were pulled down manually." He crouched beside one of the velvet folds. Then, very softly, he lifted something small between finger and thumb, a strand of silver-gray hair. Holmes placed it silently into an envelope. The local doctor cleared his throat. "There is another matter, Mr. Holmes." A message was found beside her. The physician handed him a folded sheet of paper. Holmes opened it. His face remained perfectly expressionless while he read, though I noticed his eyes narrow ever so slightly. "What is it?" I asked. Without a word he passed me the paper. It contained only a single sentence. "The curtain falls tomorrow night." Below the message appeared the same black symbol of a theatre curtain. Holmes folded the note carefully. Gregson arrived moments later accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers. The inspector looked exhausted and irritable after the night's events at the theatre. "Well," said he gruffly, "our murderer grows ambitious." Holmes glanced toward him lazily. "Murderer? You heard the doctor. Someone attempted to kill the woman." "Possibly." Gregson frowned. "What do you mean, possibly?" Holmes ignored the question entirely. "Have you identified the dead man from the theatre?" "Not yet." "Pity." The inspector's irritation deepened visibly. "I suppose you've discovered another hidden tunnel while I was gone." "No," said Holmes calmly. "Something far more interesting." "And that is?" Holmes slipped the silver-gray hair into his pocket. "A contradiction." Gregson threw up his hands. "There you go again." "Every straightforward case becomes philosophy when you touch it." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Gregson, if this case were straightforward, at least 3 people would not already be lying." The inspector stared. "Edward Fenwick, the man at the theatre, and whoever truly disappeared 14 years ago." A strange silence followed. Gregson shifted uneasily. "You still believe the old scandal matters?" "It is the only thing that matters." Holmes turned abruptly toward Mrs. Fenwick. "She will regain consciousness soon?" The doctor nodded. "Most likely within the hour. Inform me the instant she wakes." Without another word Holmes walked from the room. I followed him downstairs in considerable bewilderment. "You are hiding something from me," I said firmly once we reached the library. "My dear Watson," said he lightly, "I hide many things from many people. It preserves social harmony. This is serious. Then why not explain your conclusions?" Holmes selected a cigarette with meticulous care. "Because they remain incomplete. That has never stopped you before?" For the first time he looked genuinely amused. "Touché, Watson." He lit the cigarette and paced slowly before the cold fireplace. "There are several possibilities. Either Arthur Vale is orchestrating an elaborate revenge against the Fenwick household, or someone wishes desperately for us to believe so. And Gregson?" Holmes's expression hardened slightly. "Gregson troubles me." "You think him involved?" "I think him manipulated. Whether knowingly or otherwise remains uncertain." He paused. "Tell me, Watson, what strikes you as most peculiar regarding last night?" "The hidden passages? Expected in melodrama. The attack upon Mrs. Fenwick? Predictable escalation." I hesitated. "The dead man?" Holmes pointed toward me approvingly. "Precisely. What about him?" "He does not belong." I stared blankly. "The others," Holmes continued, "all connect to the theatre world: actors, impresarios, illusions, staged fear. Yet our dead stranger was something else entirely." "The machine grease?" Holmes stopped pacing abruptly. "And his boots? The plaster?" He leaned closer. "Watson, why would a mechanic or laborer involve himself in a 14-year-old theatrical scandal?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped, because I had no answer. Holmes smiled faintly. "Now you perceive the difficulty." Before I could continue, Briggs entered hurriedly. "Mr. Holmes, there's a gentleman below insisting upon seeing you." "What gentleman?" "He refuses to give a name." Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. "Describe him." "Tall, grey hair, looks frightened." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Arthur Vale," I whispered. "Probably." Holmes moved toward the door. "Show him in." Moments later the actor entered the library. In daylight he appeared even more worn and desperate than before. His hands trembled visibly, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The moment the door closed behind him, he spoke. "She remembers." Holmes remained perfectly calm. "Sit down, Mr. Vale. There's no time." "There is always time for accuracy." Vale ran a shaking hand through his graying hair. "She saw him last night." "Who?" Vale stared at Holmes in horror. "You know who—" Holmes's voice became suddenly cold. "No, Mr. Vale. I know only that you have lied repeatedly since this affair began." The actor recoiled. "I tried to protect her—" "From what?" Vale's face twisted painfully. "From the truth." Holmes said nothing. The silence stretched unbearably. At last Vale whispered, "Eleanor never disappeared. I felt my pulse quicken instantly." "She's alive?" I exclaimed. "Then where has she been for 14 years?" Vale closed his eyes. "Hiding." "From whom?" Vale opened them again, and in that instant I saw genuine terror there. From the man behind the curtain. A cold silence settled over the room. Holmes studied him intently. "You know his identity?" "Then speak." Vale shook his head violently. "If I tell you, we all die." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "My dear fellow, people are already dying." At that moment the front bell rang sharply below. Briggs hurried past the library door. Then came voices in the hallway. Raised voices, angry voices. A moment later Gregson burst into the room accompanied by 2 constables. "There he is!" cried the inspector triumphantly. Arthur Vale staggered backward. Gregson pointed dramatically. "I arrest you for the murder of the unidentified man at the Imperial Arcadia Theatre, and for the attempted murder of Mrs. Clara Fenwick." Vale turned desperately toward Holmes. "You know I didn't do it." Holmes remained seated, expressionless, and to my utter astonishment he merely said, "I advise you to cooperate fully with Inspector Gregson." Vale stared at him as though struck. "You can't mean that." Holmes lit another cigarette. "I mean exactly what I say." Gregson grinned broadly. "At last, Mr. Holmes, we agree on something." The constables seized Arthur Vale by the arms. As they dragged him toward the door, the actor twisted violently and shouted one final sentence toward Holmes. "You're making the same mistake Fenwick made." Then he was gone. The front door slammed heavily. Silence filled the library. I rounded furiously upon Holmes. "What are you doing?" He exhaled smoke slowly, observing, "You know Vale is frightened, not murderous. Then why allow Gregson to arrest him?" Holmes's eyes lifted toward the upper floor where Mrs. Fenwick lay recovering. "Because," said he softly, "someone in this house believes Arthur Vale knows too much." A chill passed through me. "You let him be arrested deliberately." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "My dear Watson, sometimes the safest place for a man is inside a prison cell." Before I could respond, Holmes suddenly reached for his coat and hat. "Where?" "To set a trap." His eyes gleamed with that dangerous brilliance which always appeared when his mind moved ahead of everyone else involved. And at that moment I realized something deeply troubling. Sherlock Holmes was no longer merely solving the mystery. He was baiting the killer. There are moments in every great investigation when Sherlock Holmes appeared to vanish entirely from ordinary human understanding. I had witnessed him disguised as sailors, priests, laborers, grooms, opium addicts, and once even as an elderly Italian bookseller of such convincing decrepitude that I myself passed him twice in the street without recognition. Yet no transformation ever unsettled me quite so profoundly as the one he undertook that afternoon following Arthur Vale's arrest. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when Holmes disappeared into his bedroom, locking the door behind him with unusual firmness. For nearly an hour I heard movement within the opening of drawers, the clink of bottles, the rustle of fabric, and once the low murmur of Holmes practicing a completely unfamiliar voice. At last the door opened. A stranger emerged. He was stooped, gray-haired and shabby, with yellowed teeth and watery eyes behind cracked spectacles. His clothing smelled faintly of grease and stale tobacco, while one shoulder hung lower than the other, as though from old injury. Only the sharpness of the eyes betrayed him. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. Holmes grinned unpleasantly. "Convincing?" "Perfectly." He crossed to the mirror and adjusted the frayed scarf about his neck. "You recognize the type, Watson? A mechanic, perhaps? A theatre rigger?" I stared at him, the machine grease. Holmes selected an old cap and jammed it low over his forehead. The dead man from the Imperial Arcadia was almost certainly employed backstage rigging, pulleys, curtains, trap systems. "You have identified him?" "Not yet. But his profession matters more than his name." Holmes's altered voice was astonishing. The cultured precision had vanished entirely, replaced by the rough tones of a working-class Londoner. "And now," said he, "we shall discover who still visits old theatres after dark." He handed me a revolver. "Loaded?" "Keep it concealed." "Where are we going?" "To speak with ghosts." It was nearing dusk when we reached a narrow public house near Drury Lane, frequented largely by stage hands and theatre labourers. The air within was thick with pipe smoke and the sour odour of beer. Rough men clustered around stained wooden tables discussing performances, wages, and actresses with equal profanity. Holmes entered with such complete transformation of posture and expression that even I momentarily forgot his identity. He shuffled toward the counter with weary familiarity. "Evenin', Charlie," he muttered to the barkeep. The man nodded absently. "Thought you was dead." "Nearly." Laughter followed from nearby tables. Holmes accepted a mug of ale and leaned casually against the counter while listening far more than speaking. For nearly 40 minutes he drifted through conversations with extraordinary subtlety, gradually steering discussion toward the abandoned Imperial Arcadia. At last one heavy-set laborer spat upon the floor and lowered his voice. "Place ain't empty." Holmes scratched his chin lazily. "So they say. I seen lights there last week." Another man snorted. "Probably smugglers." "Worse." The first man leaned closer. "People disappear round that theatre." Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "You been drinking too much porter." "I ain't jockin'." The laborer glanced uneasily toward the windows. "Old Fenwick done something bad there years ago." Several men fell silent immediately. One muttered, "Leave it," but Holmes persisted gently. "Thought that business was about stolen money." The heavy-set man shook his head slowly. "That's what the papers said." "What really happened?" No one answered. Then, from the darkest corner of the tavern, a quiet voice spoke. "A woman died." Every head turned. The speaker was an elderly stage carpenter with a deeply lined face and crippled hands stained permanently dark from machinery oil. Holmes drifted nearer. "You work there?" The old man nodded once. "For 20 years." "What woman?" The carpenter drained his glass shakily. "Pretty thing named Eleanor Vale." I felt my pulse quicken. "What happened to her?" Holmes asked softly. The old carpenter's eyes moved nervously around the tavern. "She found something she shouldn't have. A room." Instant silence followed. Even the barkeep stopped polishing glasses. Holmes lowered his voice. "The room above the stage?" The carpenter stared sharply. "Who told you that?" Holmes merely shrugged. The old man swallowed heavily. "Fenwick kept private meetings there. Rich men, politicians, foreigners. Blackmail?" Holmes suggested. "Maybe." "And Eleanor discovered this?" The carpenter nodded weakly. "She threatened to expose them." "What became of her?" Before the man could answer, the tavern door opened suddenly. A tall figure entered. Every conversation stopped. The newcomer wore a dark overcoat with the collar raised high against the fog. Though his face remained partially concealed beneath the brim of his hat, I immediately sensed something dangerous in the controlled stillness of his movements. The old carpenter went pale. "That's him," he whispered. Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. "The man behind the curtain?" The carpenter gave the slightest nod. The stranger moved slowly through the tavern. No one spoke to him. No one even met his gaze. He crossed directly toward the counter and ordered whiskey in a low voice I could not clearly hear. Then his eyes traveled across the room. For one terrible instant they rested directly upon Holmes. I felt certain we had been recognized, yet the man merely turned away again. Holmes, however, had become utterly motionless. I knew that look. He had noticed something vital. The stranger finished his drink and departed without another word. Only after the door closed did the tavern breathe again. "Who is he?" Holmes demanded quietly. No one answered. The old carpenter whispered at last. "He owns the curtains now." Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the door. "What does that mean?" The carpenter shook visibly. "He controls everything left from Fenwick's old business. The passages, the rooms, the secrets. His name." Again silence. Then the old man leaned close enough that only Holmes and I could hear. "Mortimer Hale." Holmes repeated the name softly. "Never heard of him." "You weren't meant—" The carpenter's voice trembled. "He worked backstage once. Quiet fellow. Learned every pulley, every hidden passage, every trapdoor in the theatre. And now? Now he knows where all the bodies are buried." A cold sensation passed through me. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. The carpenter caught his sleeve suddenly. "If you're wise, you'll leave this alone." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear sir, wisdom has never been my dominant quality." At that moment a boy burst breathlessly into the tavern carrying newspapers. Special edition. "Murder at Holloway Prison." Holmes seized a paper instantly. I saw his face harden as he read. "What is it?" I demanded. He handed me the sheet. The headline struck like a physical blow. "Prisoner found dead in cell. Arthur Vale murdered hours after arrest." Below the article appeared details already familiar to us. No signs of forced entry. Cell locked from outside. Death by strangulation. And beside the body, a small black theater curtain symbol drawn upon the wall. For the first time that day Holmes looked genuinely angry. "Too late," he murmured. The old carpenter crossed himself nervously. "I warned you." Holmes folded the paper slowly. "No," said he in a voice colder than I had ever heard from him. "You warned the wrong man." He turned sharply toward me. "Come, Watson." "Where?" "To Wycliffe Square." Holmes's eyes burned with sudden intensity. "Because Arthur Vale's death changes everything." As we stepped back into the fog-covered street, Holmes halted beneath the gaslight and spoke so quietly that I barely heard him. "The killer has made his first real mistake." "What mistake?" Holmes looked out into the swirling darkness. "He killed the only man still frightened enough to tell the truth, and in that instant I understood something terrible. Whoever stood behind the moving curtains was no longer merely protecting a secret. They were systematically eliminating every person connected to it. And Sherlock Holmes had just openly declared war against them. The journey back to Wycliffe Square was conducted in almost complete silence. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab with his arms folded tightly and his eyes half closed beneath the brim of his hat. Yet I knew from the rigid set of his features that his mind was moving with extraordinary speed. Arthur Vale was dead. Murdered inside a locked prison cell only hours after his arrest. The implications were staggering. Whoever directed this affair possessed not only cunning and patience, but influence extending even into official institutions. I had seen Holmes confront murderers, masterminds, and political conspirators before, but never had I observed that peculiar expression now resting upon his face, a cold fury sharpened by intellectual excitement. At length he spoke. "Watson, what is the greatest weakness of any conspiracy?" "Human error." "No, memory." I frowned. "I do not understand. Secrets decay unevenly. One man forgets details. Another remembers too much. Eventually contradictions appear." He leaned slightly forward. "And our entire case now hinges upon one woman's memory." "Mrs. Fenwick?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Not Mrs. Fenwick." The cab stopped suddenly. We had arrived not at Wycliffe Square, but before a narrow residential court near Kensington. I stared out in surprise. Campden Court. "The address found behind Eleanor Vale's photograph," said Holmes quietly. "Number 17 stood near the far end, a modest brick house, partly concealed behind iron railings and overgrown ivy. No light showed at the windows." Holmes paid the driver and approached the entrance cautiously. "Remain alert." "You expect danger?" "I should be disappointed without it." The front gate creaked softly as we entered. Holmes examined the doorstep immediately. Fresh footprints. "Recent?" "Within the hour." He rang the bell. No answer. Still silence. Holmes tried the handle. He glanced toward me briefly, then entered. The interior smelled faintly of dust, lavender, and extinguished candles. Unlike the theatrical gloom of Wycliffe Square, this house possessed the quiet melancholy of long isolation. Furniture stood neatly arranged beneath white coverings, and several framed photographs lined the hallway walls. Holmes lifted the lantern higher. Every photograph depicted the same woman, Eleanor Vale. Even after 14 years, her beauty remained striking: dark hair, intelligent eyes, and the confident poise of a stage actress accustomed to admiration. "She lived here alone?" I whispered. "Not entirely." Holmes pointed downward. Near the staircase lay a man's walking stick, expensive, recently used. We advanced cautiously through the lower rooms. Then, from somewhere above us came a sound, a floorboard creaking. Holmes moved instantly. We climbed the staircase in silence until we reached the upper landing. A door stood slightly open at the far end. Light flickered within. Holmes pushed the door wider. The woman standing beside the fireplace turned sharply toward us. I confess I stopped dead in astonishment. Even after years of fear and concealment, Eleanor Vale remained remarkably beautiful. She appeared perhaps in her early 40s, though anxiety and isolation had left faint traces upon her features. Her dark hair showed streaks of silver, and her expression carried the exhausted alertness of one long hunted. Most striking of all was her resemblance to Mrs. Fenwick. Not physical resemblance alone, but something deeper. Recognition flashed across Holmes's face instantly. "So," said he softly, "it was true." The woman's eyes widened in terror. "You shouldn't have come here." Holmes removed his disguise hat calmly. "My dear Miss Vale, murder has a way of forcing introduction." She recoiled slightly. "Arthur?" The color drained from her face. "No, murdered this evening." For a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Then she gripped the mantelpiece for support. "He promised he would stay hidden." Holmes studied her closely. "Just as you have hidden for 14 years. She looked toward me suddenly. "Who is this?" "Dr. Watson, my friend and colleague." Something in my expression perhaps reassured her, for her shoulders relaxed slightly. "You know everything, then?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet, but enough to understand that Edward Fenwick's death was no accident." The effect of those words was extraordinary. Eleanor Vale closed her eyes. Holmes stepped nearer. "You were there the night he died." "And Clara Fenwick." Another silence. "She was there too." I exchanged a stunned glance with Holmes. The woman sank slowly into a chair. "It began at the theatre," she said faintly. "Everything began there." Holmes remained standing. The room above the stage. Her eyes lifted sharply toward him. "You found it?" She gave a bitter laugh. "Edward believed no one would ever discover it." "What occurred there?" Eleanor Vale hesitated for several seconds before speaking. "Powerful men met there secretly. Politicians, foreign agents, wealthy patrons. Edward arranged introductions. For blackmail? For information." Holmes nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. They discussed things which could destroy careers, governments even. Edward kept records of everything. The letters. I felt a growing horror as the picture formed." "And you discovered this?" "One night by accident." She looked toward the darkened window. "Arthur begged me to ignore it, but I threatened to go to the police." "And Fenwick?" He became terrified. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Because he was not the true organizer." Eleanor stared at him. "You know about Hale, Mortimer Hale." At the name she visibly trembled. "He controls everything now." "Who is he, really?" For the first time genuine fear entered her face. "He was Edward's stage engineer. Quiet. Invisible. Everyone overlooked him." Holmes smiled faintly. "Which made him dangerous. He built the hidden passages, the observation rooms, the concealed entrances, and eventually realized the value of what passed through them." Eleanor nodded weakly. "He began collecting secrets for himself." Holmes's voice hardened. "And when you threatened exposure? He arranged the accident. Fenwick's carriage crash." She looked directly at Holmes. "It was no accident." A cold silence followed. "And Clara Fenwick knew this?" I asked. "Why remain silent?" Eleanor's expression became deeply sorrowful. "Because Clara loved Edward, even after discovering what he had become." Holmes paced slowly toward the fireplace. "So for 14 years Hale has maintained control through fear." "He watches constantly," Eleanor whispered. "The curtains, the passages, the theater, they all belong to him." "Why attack Clara now?" "Because she began remembering." Holmes stopped abruptly. "Remembering what?" Eleanor's eyes filled suddenly with tears. "The night Edward died." A sharp knock interrupted the silence. 3 knocks. Measured. Every color vanished from Eleanor Vale's face. "He's here!" Holmes extinguished the lamp instantly. The room plunged into darkness. Again came the knock. Then a voice from below. Male, and terrifyingly controlled. "Miss Vale," it called softly, "you have entertained guests rather late." Holmes moved soundlessly toward the door. "Watson," he whispered, revolver ready. My pulse thundered. The voice below continued almost pleasantly. "Mr. Holmes, I believe you have interfered sufficiently." Holmes smiled faintly in the darkness. "At last," he murmured, "the curtain rises." Then the front door downstairs opened, and footsteps began ascending slowly toward us. The footsteps on the stairs were unhurried. That, more than anything else, told me the truth about the man approaching us. Confidence of that kind does not belong to an intruder, it belongs to a master of the house. Holmes stood perfectly still beside the door, one hand raised slightly, signaling absolute silence. Eleanor Vale had pressed herself against the far wall, her face pale as parchment in the darkness. The staircase creaked again, closer now. Second landing. Then the sound stopped. A pause followed long enough to feel intentional. And then the voice spoke again, just outside the upper corridor. "Miss Vale," it said softly, "you have always chosen the wrong audience." Eleanor trembled violently. Holmes whispered without turning his head, "Do not answer." The door handle moved slowly. not forced, not rushed, as though whoever stood outside knew already that it was unlocked. Holmes raised his revolver slightly. The door opened. A figure stood in the doorway, immaculately dressed in a dark overcoat that seemed almost too refined for such a decaying house. His posture was calm, almost theatrical, and his face, though partially shadowed by the corridor light, carried an expression of quiet, controlled amusement. Mortimer Hale. I knew it instantly, though I had never seen him before. There are men whose presence announces itself before their features are understood. He stepped inside. "I wondered," he said gently, "how long it would take you to arrive, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not move. "Mr. Hale, I presume." A faint smile touched the man's lips. "I am pleased to find my reputation has survived obscurity." His eyes moved slowly around the room. "And Dr. Watson? How gratifying!" Eleanor spoke suddenly from the corner, her voice shaking. "You killed Arthur." Hale did not even glance at her. "I preserve balance." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Balance? Order, if you prefer a more polite term." Holmes's voice remained calm. "You murdered a prisoner inside a locked cell." "That," said Hale lightly, "was regrettable necessity." A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke again. "You also orchestrated the death of Edward Fenwick." For the first time Hale's expression changed, slightly less amusement, more interest. "Ah," he murmured. "So Clara has spoken." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So it is true." Hale folded his hands behind his back. "Truth is a flexible concept, Mr. Holmes, especially in theater." Eleanor whispered sharply, "You turned him into a monster." Hale finally looked at her. "No, Miss Vale. I merely revealed what he already was." Holmes stepped forward slightly. "Let us dispense with philosophy. Why the curtain?" A faint smile returned. "Because, Mr. Holmes, people fear what they cannot see, and what lies behind it. Everything important." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You built the hidden passages. Of course, you controlled access to Fenwick's secrets. And when the system began collapsing?" Hale sighed softly. "I repaired it. By murder? By maintenance." The words hung in the air like something poisonous. Holmes's tone became colder. "You believe that killing Arthur Vale was maintenance?" He threatened exposure, like his sister once did. Eleanor stepped forward suddenly. "I never exposed anything." Hale turned to her slowly. "You ran," Holmes interjected sharply, "and Mrs. Fenwick." A pause. Then Hale smiled again. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Clara remembers too much." Holmes's eyes flickered. "So you attempted to silence her tonight." "I attempted to correct instability." Holmes took another step forward. "And the man at the theater?" Hale nodded. "An unfortunate complication. The dead laborer." Holmes's gaze hardened. "You used—" "I prefer the term employed." A faint sound escaped me involuntarily. Even I had begun to feel the full weight of what stood before us. Holmes, however, remained composed. "You have been living in the abandoned house beside Wycliffe Square." "Convenient access," Hale agreed. "You entered through hidden passages." "Of course." "You terrorized Mrs. Fenwick using staged appearances." Hale inclined his head. "An excellent subject. Highly suggestible." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the voice she heard?" "Simple acoustics. Old theater tricks." Holmes was silent for a moment. "And Edward Fenwick's death?" For the first time Hale's expression hardened slightly. He was becoming unstable. "In what sense?" "He intended to sell everything." Holmes stepped closer. "To whom?" Hale smiled thinly. "To the police." A silence followed. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Holmes spoke quietly. "So you killed him." "I corrected him, and disguised it as an accident." Hale nodded. "The simplest solutions are often the most enduring." Eleanor made a sound of anguish. Holmes suddenly turned toward her. "And Mrs. Fenwick knows this?" A pause. "Yes," she whispered. Holmes's expression changed subtly. "Then she is not merely a victim." Hale gave a slight shrug. "Clara is." Holmes turned back sharply. "What does that mean?" For the first time Hale hesitated, a fraction of uncertainty. Then he smiled again, but less confidently. "It means, Mr. Holmes, that memory is not always reliable." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Interesting choice of words. A sudden noise came from downstairs. A door opening. Voices. Holmes tensed instantly. Hale listened, then sighed. "It appears your Inspector Gregson has arrived." Holmes looked sharply. "You summoned him?" "Of course." Hale smiled faintly. "Because endings require witnesses." At that moment heavy footsteps rushed up the stairs. Gregson's voice echoed through the corridor. "Holmes!" The inspector burst into the room, followed by two constables, breathless and alarmed. What the devil is going on here? He stopped instantly upon seeing Hale. Then Eleanor. Then Holmes. Then the revolver in Holmes's hand. Gregson frowned. You are all under suspicion of obstruction of justice. Holmes did not even look at him. Hale, said Holmes quietly, you are under arrest. Gregson blinked. Hale remained perfectly calm. For what charge exactly? Holmes's voice was steady. For orchestrating multiple murders, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy spanning 14 years. Gregson laughed sharply. On what evidence? Holmes turned slightly. On confession. Gregson looked confused. What confession? Holmes pointed at Hale. He has just admitted everything. Gregson stared. Hale smiled. Did I? Holmes nodded. Quite clearly. A pause. Then Hale sighed. For the first time something cold appeared in his expression. Then I suppose this is the moment. He moved suddenly, not toward Holmes, not toward Gregson, but toward Eleanor. Everything happened in an instant. Holmes fired. The shot shattered the window glass behind Hale. Gregson shouted. The constables rushed forward, but Hale was already gone, not through the door, not down the stairs, but into the wall. A panel swung open behind him, perfectly concealed. Holmes lunged forward instantly. After him. We rushed through the hidden passage just as Hale vanished into darkness beyond. And as we entered that concealed world once more, this time in pursuit, I realized with a sudden chill that we were no longer investigating a crime. We were inside the final act of a theater that had been running for 14 years, and Mortimer Hale had just closed the curtain behind him. The passage swallowed us whole. Behind the sliding panel the air changed, instantly cooler, older, and thick with the smell of damp brick and machine oil. Holmes led the way without hesitation, lantern held low, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the narrow walls. Behind us came Gregson's voice, sharp with confusion. "Holmes, where does that lead?" "Where all secrets end," Holmes replied over his shoulder. The corridor sloped downward, not gently, but deliberately, as though the house itself were sinking into the earth. Eleanor Vale clutched my arm tightly as we followed. I could feel her trembling, though whether from fear or exhaustion I could not tell. The passage widened after a few yards into a junction of old brick tunnels. Some had clearly been sealed for decades, while others showed fresh disturbance scratches in the mortar, footprints in dust too recent to belong to history. Holmes stopped abruptly. "2 directions," I said. "3," Holmes corrected. He pointed. A faint draught moved through a hidden gap in the wall. "And that," he added quietly, "is the one we want." Gregson arrived panting behind us. "This is madness," he muttered. "We're chasing a man through a cellar system under a private residence." "Not a residence," Holmes interrupted. "What then?" Holmes glanced around. That single word changed the atmosphere entirely. Even Gregson fell silent. We continued deeper. The tunnels became more structured the farther we went, as though designed rather than dug-arched ceilings, reinforced beams, old iron fixtures embedded in the walls. Then, faintly ahead, came a sound, a mechanical click. Holmes halted instantly. "Do not move." We froze. The sound repeated. Then another, like ropes tightening somewhere in the dark. Holmes raised the lantern slightly. Ahead of us the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, and what I saw there remains one of the most extraordinary sights of my life. We were beneath a theater. Not just any theater, but an entire concealed structure beneath the surface world. Above us rose wooden scaffolds, pulley systems, counterweights, and vast iron frameworks supporting what must have been the stage floor of the Imperial Arcadia. But this was not abandoned. It was active. Somewhere above, faint footsteps crossed wood. Curtains shifted, and machinery moved in silent precision. Holmes stepped forward slowly. "An underground stage," he murmured. "Ingenious." Gregson stared in disbelief. "But who would build such a thing?" Holmes's voice was calm. "Someone who never wanted to be seen." Eleanor whispered behind me. "This wasn't here 14 years ago." Holmes turned slightly. "No," he said. "It evolved." We moved carefully across the chamber. Then Holmes stopped again. In the center of the space stood a raised platform. Upon it lay something covered in a dark cloth. Holmes approached it cautiously and pulled the cloth aside. Beneath it, a control system, levers, pulleys, and a complex arrangement of mechanical devices connected to wires leading upward into the theater structure. Gregson blinked. "What is it?" Holmes examined it closely. "A remote stage control system." "For what purpose?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled one lever gently, above us, somewhere in the unseen theater. A curtain moved. Gregson stiffened. "What the devil?" Holmes pulled another. A second curtain shifted elsewhere. Then another. Holmes looked upward thoughtfully. "It allows someone here to control the entire theater above without ever being seen," Eleanor whispered. Holmes nodded slowly. Gregson suddenly grabbed Holmes's arm. "Enough of this. Where is Hale?" Holmes pointed ahead. A narrow staircase ascended from the chamber toward a faint light. He went up. We climbed, step by step. The air grew warmer. And finally, we reached an iron door. Holmes placed his hand on it, then pushed. It opened, and we stepped into a space that made even Sherlock Holmes fall silent for a brief moment. We were behind the main stage of the Imperial Arcadia, but it was no longer abandoned. Lights burned overhead. Curtains hung freshly drawn, and the entire theater was occupied. Rows of shadowed figures filled the audience seats below. Motionless, watching, Gregson whispered hoarsely, "What is this?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A performance." From the stage below, Mortimer Hale's voice echoed calmly. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes." The lights dimmed slightly. A single spotlight appeared on center stage. Hale stood beneath it, perfectly composed, almost smiling. "I was hoping you would reach the final act." Holmes stepped forward onto the stage. "End it, Hale." Hale spread his arms slightly. "But we have barely begun." Holmes's voice sharpened. "The dead man at the theater. Arthur Vale. Edward Fenwick. The attempted murder of Mrs. Fenwick." "Ah," Hale interrupted gently. "You misunderstand the structure." He walked slowly across the stage. "This is not a sequence of murders." He turned. "This is a revelation?" Holmes did not move. Hale gestured toward the audience. "These people," he said softly, "are not witnesses." A pause. "They are participants." Gregson shouted from behind. "What are you talking about?" Hale smiled. 14 years ago, something happened in this theater that was never recorded properly. Not because it was hidden, but because it was performed." Eleanor whispered suddenly. "No." Holmes turned slightly toward her. "What is it?" Tears filled her eyes. "He's lying." But her voice lacked conviction. Hale continued calmly. "Edward Fenwick did not die in a carriage accident." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "He was killed in this theater." A murmur passed through the silent audience. Hale raised a hand. "And not by me." Holmes spoke quietly. "By whom then?" Hale turned slightly. "Ask Mrs. Fenwick." All eyes shifted as footsteps echoed from the back of the theater. A figure entered. Clara Fenwick. Pale, unsteady, but awake. Eleanor gasped. Holmes stared. "You should not be here." Clara's voice trembled. "I remember now." A long silence followed. Then she spoke again. "I was there." Holmes's expression changed subtly. Hale smiled faintly. At last, Clara stepped forward. "Edward found out everything. The room above the stage, the meetings, the names. He said he would expose them all." Her voice broke slightly. "So we stopped him." Gregson's face drained of color. "We?" Clara looked down. "I didn't mean to." Holmes's voice was quiet. "Who was with you?" A pause. Then she whispered. "Mortimer." A collective silence fell across the theater. Hale nodded slowly. "We had no choice." Holmes took a step forward. "And Arthur Vale." Hale's expression hardened slightly. "He knew." "So you silenced him?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "And Eleanor Vale." Clara broke down completely. She wasn't supposed to survive. Eleanor stepped forward suddenly. "I ran." Clara nodded. "And I let you." Holmes finally spoke. "So this entire structure, the passages, the theater control system, the staged hauntings, was built to preserve a cover-up." Hale inclined his head. "Preserve?" He smiled faintly. "Continue." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Continue what?" Hale stepped closer. "The performance." A pause. Then softly. "And tonight, Mr. Holmes, it concludes." The lights in the theater flickered. The audience below remained motionless. Then, one by one, they began to rise. Gregson stepped back. "What is happening?" Holmes's voice was cold. "An audience does not stand unless the act demands it." Hale smiled. "And the final act always requires closure." The stage machinery above us began to move, slowly, deliberately. Curtains shifting, ropes tightening, a final mechanism engaging somewhere deep within the theater. Holmes whispered, "Watson, move." And as the entire theater began to transform around us, I understood with chilling clarity. We were no longer solving a mystery. We were standing inside its final collapse. The theater had become a living mechanism, Everywhere round us, unseen machinery awakened with a slow, deliberate intelligence. Ropes tightened overhead. Iron pulleys shifted in their housings. The vast stage above groaned as if the entire building had begun to breathe for the first time in years. Holmes stood at the edge of the stage, perfectly still, his eyes moving not with panic but with calculation. Gregson, by contrast, had lost all composure. "This is insane!" he shouted. "Everyone back! Back to the stairs!" But there were no easy exits anymore. The doors through which we had entered had been sealed by descending stage panels. Even as we watched, heavy curtains dropped across them like closing eyelids. Mortimer. Hale remained at center stage, unmoved, almost serene. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "truth is not something that emerges. It is something that is arranged." Holmes took a slow step forward. "Then arrange it now," he replied. A faint smile crossed Hale's face. "Oh, I intend to—" He raised one hand slightly, and the lights in the theatre dimmed, not extinguished, controlled, as though the building itself had responded to him. From the audience below a low murmur began. Not panic, not confusion, anticipation. Eleanor Vale clutched her chest. "They're still here," she whispered. Holmes glanced briefly toward her. "Who are they?" Before she could answer, Clara Fenwick spoke from behind us in a broken voice. "Witnesses?" Gregson turned sharply. "What witnesses?" Clara shook her head slowly. "The men who were there that night." A silence fell. Holmes's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean the night Edward Fenwick died?" Hale nodded. He walked slowly across the stage. "I told you before, Mr. Holmes, this is not a cover-up. It is continuity." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You recreated the entire theatre to preserve a staged version of events." Hale spread his hands slightly. "Preserve? No." He gestured toward the audience again. 14 years ago, Edward Fenwick died here in front of them. Not accidentally, not secretly, publicly. Gregson barked a short laugh. "That's absurd." But Hale did not react. Instead, he continued calmly. "And tonight we perform it again." A chill passed through me. Holmes spoke slowly. "You intend to stage a reenactment. For what purpose?" Hale's expression softened slightly. Gregson stepped forward angrily. "You're insane!" Hale looked at him for the first time directly. "No, Inspector. I am consistent." The machinery above us shifted again. Holmes suddenly turned sharply toward the upper rigging. "Watson, look up." I followed his gaze. High above the stage, within the iron framework, a system of counterweights had begun descending. Slowly, precisely aligned. Holmes's eyes flickered. Hale smiled faintly. "Everything is rigged, Mr. Holmes. That is the nature of theatre." Holmes suddenly moved, not toward Hale, but toward the control platform beneath the stage edge. Gregson shouted, "Holmes, where are you going?" To stop this, Hale watched him calmly. "You cannot—" Holmes ignored him. He reached the control system we had seen earlier underground, the levers that control the entire theatre. For the first time, Hale's composure tightened slightly. "You don't understand it," he said. Holmes pulled a lever. Nothing happened. He tried another. A curtain shifted above, and a section of the stage began to rise. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "It is synchronized." Hale nodded. "With the past." Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, help me!" I rushed forward, gripping the mechanism with him. Together we forced the levers downward. Some responded. Others resisted. Above us the theatre began to transform rapidly. Curtains moved in unnatural sequences. Lights flickered. The audience below remained frozen, but their heads turned in unison. All toward the stage. All toward us. Clara Fenwick cried out suddenly, "It's starting!" Gregson grabbed Holmes. "Stop whatever you're doing!" Holmes shook him off. "I am trying to prevent a staged collapse." Hale raised his voice slightly. Too late. The entire theatre shuddered. A sound. A deep mechanical release. Somewhere above the stage a massive support system disengaged. Holmes froze. I looked up. The central chandelier, enormous, iron-framed, heavy with gas lamps, began to descend slowly. Gregson swore violently. "It's falling!" Hale's voice was almost gentle. "It is remembering." Holmes suddenly looked at Hale with a clarity I had not seen before. "No," he said quietly. "It is being triggered." Hale smiled. "Memory and mechanism are the same thing here." Holmes turned abruptly toward Clara Fenwick. "You killed Edward Fenwick." Clara staggered. "I told you." Holmes cut her off sharply. "You staged it, but the mechanism did the rest." Holmes's eyes burned now with absolute certainty. "You did not murder him directly. You designed a theatre where his death could be performed." Hale's smile faded slightly. Holmes continued. "And every year since, you have preserved it by controlling those who knew." He pointed at Hale. "You are not the author of this crime. A pause. You are its stage manager." A sudden silence fell across the theatre. Even Hale did not speak. Holmes turned slightly. "And Arthur Vale?" Holmes's voice hardened. "He was never your enemy. He was your witness," Clara whispered. "He saw everything." Holmes nodded. "And you tried to erase him twice." Hale spoke quietly. "And yet he survived long enough to tell you almost nothing." Holmes stepped forward. "Because you were afraid of what he might remember." A long silence. Then Holmes said the final line. "But the person you were truly afraid of was Mrs. Fenwick." Clara's face went pale. Eleanor gasped. Holmes turned slowly. "Because she did not just witness the murder." He looked directly at Clara. "She participated in the final act." Clara trembled violently. "That's not true." Holmes's voice was calm. "It is the only explanation that fits all contradictions." The theatre fell utterly silent. Holmes continued. "Edward Fenwick discovered the truth in the upper room. He confronted both of you. A struggle occurred, and the performance was not meant to end with death but with silence." Clara whispered. "No." Holmes's eyes softened slightly, but only slightly, and the silence failed. A pause. "Because memory does not die neatly." The chandelier above us groaned louder. Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, we must leave now," Gregson shouted. "The exits are sealed." Holmes looked toward the stage machinery. "No, they are not." He moved rapidly toward the control system. "This theatre was designed to open." Hale stepped forward. "If you do that, everything collapses." Holmes looked at him. "Then it collapses." He pulled the final lever. A deep mechanical roar filled the theatre. Curtains began to retract. Panels shifted. Hidden doors unlocked. The entire structure responded like a waking machine finally completing its cycle. Gregson shouted, "It's opening!" Holmes grabbed my arm. We moved, all of us, through shifting curtains, through rising panels, through collapsing illusions. Behind us, Hale stood motionless beneath the falling chandelier, and as we reached the exit passage, Holmes turned once, just once, and said, "The curtain was never the crime." A pause. It was the hiding place. Then we ran. We emerged into dawn. Behind us the Imperial Arcadia trembled once more and then fell into absolute silence. No explosion, no collapse, only stillness. Holmes stood watching for a long time. Gregson whispered, "What happens now?" Holmes adjusted his coat. "Now," he said quietly, "the theatre is closed." A pause. "And the audience has finally left." Eleanor Vale looked toward the building. "And Clara?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Still inside the performance, that evening, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes remained unusually silent. At last I asked, "Was Hale the mastermind?" Holmes shook his head. "Then who?" Holmes looked into the fire. "The man who built the stage where truth could be performed instead of told." I frowned. "And that was?" Holmes's voice was very quiet. "Edward Fenwick." A long silence followed. Then Holmes added, "And every curtain after him was only echo.